This is when the SEC was created. It was created by the president, Roosevelt, in June 6, 1934. There was not much oversight of the United States securities market, and because of this, they finally created an act that was the Securities Exchange Commission. That's when the SEC was born. And then this finally started to regulate a lot of large public companies. And that's when it started to begin. And a lot of large companies started to become public after this because it was safe now. And that's when, boom of that. And this happened in 1934. Look, that happened here, June. That happened right here towards this month. After a boom all this time. And I'm pretty sure everyone was waiting like, no, we're still in a recession. We're still in a recession. Yeah, you're probably in a recession in the economy, but that doesn't reflect the markets. And yeah, that's when the SEC was created. In 1935, that the Social Security was created because of the terrible things that happened in the Great Depression. They realized the importance of the employers' benefits to keep them sure enough that they're able to be safe in a terrible economic event that could happen again. And the Social Security was made in 1935. And you can see from the 30s, ever since the Great Depression, look, the market kept going up. 1935. And then by 1936, during this period when people started to, see a bit of progress and started to see a lot of the issues they faced 6 years ago, really, started to become more resolved and started to decrease in amount of people unemployed, and now people finally getting back to jobs and everything returning back to normal after the very gray area. And look, the market went up a lot. It went up from $40. Now it went up, and especially in this time where the liquidity in the markets wasn't a lot either. Look, it went up all the way to $190. It's almost 200. It went up by 500%. And I'm pretty sure people here were still waiting for another recession, and they missed out all this gain. And this is why I talk about that the markets are not the economy. That's why there is no best, great, perfect time to invest. The best time to invest is now, right? I'm talking about to invest now for the very long term. It's not the best time to invest, not all the time if you're waiting for a short-term return, but at any time, it's always a good time to invest if you're waiting for a very, very long time return. And that's sort of the expectation, the mentality you should have. Because I know in the long term, you're going to make money for sure. In the short term, I don't know, because that's a very unpredictable game. Anything can happen. A bubble, but you never expected this catastrophe happening. You never expected, like, sure, I'm pretty sure in this time I existed and I was, let's say the mentality I have now in my in-depthness in the markets, I would have already anticipated some crash to happen, but not to this level. Because what really affected this was everything in total. The employees, the banks, the companies flopping more than I thought. Like, it's just, you can never expect what it can collide with afterwards. Similar to if a bomb was set off, you can never predict the lengths of which it can affect other objects around it. And that's exactly what happens when the market wants to go down. It's never because of one reason. It's because of many reasons that collided with each other as the problem set off. That's why the market goes down. It's never because of one particular reason. The more reasons the market goes down as time goes on, the more the market will go down in that instant. But also goes in that the more the market goes down in those instances, the more likely it's going to go up. That's why no one can predict that, because no one can predict the fullest extent. No one's going to tell you over here. No one is. No one's going to tell you that the market's going to completely collapse. The economy is going to collapse. All the banks are going to fail. There's going to be a huge crisis. There's going to be a riot in the Washington, D.C. People are going to, the third of the entire population of the U.S. is going to be unemployed. People are going to lose all their savings. People would have sent you to an asylum if they would have heard, and no one would have said that either, because you can't exactly predict every single thing that can happen. You can only anticipate a portion of an area to happen. And that's why, to me, timing the market is just pointless completely. It's so pointless because you never can be exactly right. So there's just no point of timing the market. What's better is to at least enter in a good area. And that's what I do. I never enter in a bottom, or I'm never waiting for a bottom. I don't do that, because if I do that, I'm going to be poor, because the market will keep going up if it wants to, and it should. And whose fault is that? That's my fault, because I should be aware of that stuff. And that's what I'm trying to show here, that despite a lot of the economic struggles and the panic that people are selling you, the market went up so much. And looking over here, the market crashed again. And let's see what happened in this year. This was in 1937. Yeah, so this happened because there was a sterilization of gold inflows. Keep in mind, one of the biggest assets in this time was gold. They were the biggest gold holder in the entire world. And let's look at specifically what happened and what caused it. During 1937 and June 1938, this recession was America's third worst downturn of the 20th century, and real GDP dropping 10% and unemployment hitting 20%. It was less severe than the recessions of 1920 and 1929, obviously. 1937 recession occurred during the recovery of the Great Depression. The recovery began in 1933 and culminated during the World War, and the recession of 1937 lived quietly in the Great Depression's shadow. According to the literature of the subject, the possible cause of that recession was a contraction in the money supply caused by the Federal Reserve and Treasury Department policies and contractionary fiscal policies. By 36, to prevent an injurious credit expansion, Fed policymakers doubled reserve requirements ratios to soak up bank excess reserves, and which is money above the amount banks were required to hold as a fraction of customers' deposits. So it's the same. Remember that in 1929 to 1930 to 31, all these banks had the majority of their depositors' money into the stock market. Well, now, because obviously many people are now very skeptical of the stock market, many people are putting that money into a different asset, which is most likely into these excess reserves, which are much more less volatile, a bit more safer, and in the case for loan depositors, that can make the bank more and more money. But the problem was that they were so, think about it. Think about the bank's perspective. They were so fearful to not get into any other asset, but to be so safe that they put up so much money into these excess reserves. If you look from the excess reserves by 1933, that was $500 million. Now it's about 3.3 billion in December 1935. That's a huge difference. The reason why many banks held so many large quantity of reserves was because uncertainty associated with running on banking system from 29 to 23, to 33, and the ensuring economic problems probably explains part of the increase in excess reserves. Friedman and Schwartz shared the view that banks increased their preference for reserves in the wake of the 1929 crash. This also incentivized from low interest rates also being the high cause of the level excess reserves. It may have well been more than an important reason for the increase of those excess reserves. So remember that when there's low interest rates, there's more incentive to lend more assets because you're paying less interest for that. So there's more incentive to get loans, to get into payments, and that increases your amount of cash in order to invest in an asset, which in this case, banks did it in excess reserves in the case of risk comparison compared to any other assets. So they wanted to keep so much money into these excess reserves that it overinflated it. And the reason is that when short-term rates are low, it is less costly to hold large amounts of non-interest earning reserves than to repeatedly incur the fixed costs of adjusting it. So rather than currently adjust the amount of reserves, it's much more profitable to hold these large amounts in this economic scenario that the short-term rates are low because they're less costly to hold bigger amounts. So that was the big reason. But the biggest reason was what I just explained. It was just this fear of the bank to not mess up again, that they wanted to secure themselves as much as possible where they went too far, which is putting a lot of money into these excess reserves. And the Fed's contractionary policy was complemented by the Treasury decision by late June 1936 to sterilize gold inflows in order to reduce excess reserves. So that's the reason why. They were looking any way possible to reduce these excess reserves or else they'll face long-term consequence. That the first thing they did was to sterilize the gold inflows because the majority of these reserves were really gold. And then the sterilization policy severed the link between gold inflows and monetary expansion. So by preventing gold inflows from becoming part of the monetary base, this policy abruptly halted what had been a strong monetary expansion. So from this, the combined impact of the rise in reserve requirements and the no less important on the Treasury gold sterilization program, that's what made first drop the rate of increase of monetary stock. And of course, that converted it into a decline. And that's when the markets got feared because wanting a bigger monetary expansion plus the huge inflated on excess reserves. And when you see excess reserves drop profusely with monetary expansion, people are not going to like that. And that's going to create a lot of fear in the markets, especially Wall Street selling that fear. Fiscal policy also hardly helped. The Social Security payroll tax debuted in 1937. On top of the tax increase mandated by the Revenue Act of 1935, the changes in net effective government spending have been heavily emphasized as cause of both the recession and the revival of 1937-1938. And by 1939, Mariner Esselis said that there's too rapid withdrawals of the government stimulus, accompanied by the other important facts that led to the rapid deflation of the fall because there was a huge drop in monetary expansion and there was a huge drop in excess reserves, which is really a lot of the assets in the backed up assets by the FDIC with the bank's depositors' money that it had to reduce, which was sterilizing that gold, having a temporary set hold, a stop in spending that. And of course, that decreed back towards the monetary expansion because it's like the rates, right? If many of the excess reserves are going up and they stop, well, obviously the monetary expansion is going to stop because it kept going up because of the excess reserves. But the reason why they had to stop it or else it'll get out of control. So if they stop it, it will obviously drop down, but it will drop down to normal. But no one was aware of this stuff. And that's what led to also because of a lot of the high excess reserves and Wall Street selling the panic on this, that's what led to the market declining further. But if you look at 1938 by March, look, the market bottomed and shot up completely. So you see, this is why I say that the market bottoms when no one expects it to. Like, who in the hell would have thought that the market would go up from this point? No one did, but it did. And the market bottoms when no one else thinks it will. And look, ever since the market kept going up. But then this is where things get interesting, which I'll get in a moment. So this was of a too rapid withdrawal of the government stimulus. That's what I just said. And rapid deflation that fell in 1937, which continued until the present spending program of the government was beginning in the last summer by 1939. Yeah, and these are actually the high officials under an investigation of the government fiscal policy. So yeah, back in that time. Well, it's pretty funny to look at the charts back in that time. But yeah, that was by 1937. That's what caused the crash, with the high excess reserves and gold inflows from a fear of having another over-leveraged, unpredicted crash where all the others' monies are gone because you put it into a different asset that they thought was the safest asset in there. We're going to put it in the gold, excess gold reserves, because it's backed up by many of these organizations, and it's long-term growth that they went up too much, right? And that's pretty normal, right? It's like, think about it like a child. If a child gets hurt after something terrible, they're going to try something so much as possible to the extreme that they're going to overdo that other factor to prevent another injury, which they injured themselves by preventing it, which is hilarious because they went up too far and they had a blind spot in another area and they got hit in the face. So that's what happened in 1937. And what caused the market to drop down more inevitably was because of, remember, the Federal Reserve put these excess reserve requirements, which stopped any more spending in them temporarily, which of course dropped the market, because that led to the monetary expansion drop enormously because that monetary expansion was going along with this super hyper amount of excess reserve spending. So when that excess reserve spending stops, there's no reason that monetary expansion is going to go up more. It's going to come down back, but they needed to go back to normal. And that's what happened. It went back to normal because it was beyond the average of what's supposed to be done because of fear. And now the market went down because of fear again. So it bottomed. This is the thing that you should know. Like, it's just these type of stuff, and the market eventually bottoms. And now things start to get interesting. Look at this. By 1938, the output now, despite this event that happened, the output now was 49% for 4 years ahead. And this was fueled by the gold inflows from Europe in a major defense buildup. Now, until 1939, that's when Nazi Germany became a big problem to the world, because in September 1939, Hitler invaded Poland with the Soviet Union, and the market in 1939 sort of stayed stagnant. And you can see that that happened in September, right? And look at this. By September 9th, when Hitler invaded Poland, look, the market went up. So you see, it's irrational. Like, you can't, if something happens, look at what it does. It goes up. So you can't invest based on macro, even in a bad event. However, people started to see that this could become a bit of more of an issue because Hitler in Nazi Germany started to build up so much strength that it could be a much more possible threat that they thought with the allies in Europe, because people weren't thinking specifically. Remember that in this time, the U.S. was not involved as a immediate threat for Germany to go into war. Of course, they were an enemy to the U.S. because the Nazi was really an enemy to everyone, but they saw that as a huge threat towards civilization. During this time, Hitler and his country started to gain a lot of economic power and had an efficient system to create a lot of military spending, a lot of machines, and very high advanced. Like, that was the technology back then. They had a lot of military power, and they started to easily beat all these countries like Poland, that they started to strengthen their defense. And on top of that, they made an agreement with Russia during that time, the Soviet Union. So this led to a lot of, let's say, skepticism in Wall Street, because they were worried whether the problem was getting a bit worse, not because of the US was getting involved, but because of how the allies would respond, because the US wants to sell weapons to these allies, and they know if Russia and Germany are getting stronger by conquering Poland, as an example, easily, that they conquered them in a few days, that goes to show the power that they're going up against. So that caused this stagnation, and eventually, when the market was stagnant, right in May 10th of 1940, the reason why the market completely fell on that day and it kept falling more, looks like COVID, the market was completely bleeding, is because that's exactly the day that Hitler invaded Germany, Belgium, Luxembourg, and Netherlands at once. And Wall Street got scared, as they know, as the French were weak, and it was unlikely that they were going to use the weapons and resources the US was selling them, including the other defeated countries. So additionally, there was also wide panic rumors that from this event that the stock exchange would close to, hence causing more panic selling. So you can see Wall Street panic. Let's look at those events. Yeah, so here's an article, is a picture of real life picture in the 40s. This guy's pretty sad. Obviously it's a terrible event what happened there, but it's always important to learn from the mistakes of others, and that's what we're doing. The fourth and final bear market of the 1930s was preceded by a brief buying panic that began in August of 1939. That was the same month that Germany and Russia stunned the world with a non-aggression pact, leading many observers to fear that a second world war was imminent. Then on September 1st of 1939, those fears were realized as Germany's divisions rumbled into Poland. After 4 years of failed appeasement with Germany, France and Britain declared war 2 days after that invasion, and nearly a decade of worldwide aggressions and confrontations had finally culminated into the Second World War of the century. You need to recall that, I don't know how much of you know about history. Germany suffered such a huge setback after World War I because they lost the war. And they lost so much money in the war that from spending that Germany's GDP went down so much, and people were physically poor. They were so poor, the people, that it was very intense in that time. And during these times, Hitler was so furious with in the entire Europe and world that's when he started to create these fantasies, thinking that the main causer of all these bad consequences is the Jewish people, and that's where he gets this idea. And I think this stuff is just important to understand why all these things are happening, because they're interplaying before all these events happen, because it culminates from a consequence of a nation feeling resentment, and they want to get revenge towards back the world. And that's what's happening. Germany wanted to get revenge in what happened, what enemies of World War I had done to them. And one of the biggest ones of that were France and England, the port of Jerusalem, when the Ottoman Empire still kind of existed until they fell, like a few years later, especially in World War II. During this time, the U.S. immediately declared its neutrality, but Wall Street was giddy with the prospects of providing the combatants with the materials needed for the war. Brokerage houses encouraged the buying frenzy by publishing statistics on how well the so-called war bride stocks performed after the outbreak of the First World War. The press was enthusiastic as well, with Business Week presenting an article titled "War Makes Its Sellers Market." In early September, by mid-September, Nation magazine ran an article titled "Boom is On." From a low of 131 in late August, the Dow rallied to a peak of 155. The rally was substantial, but it was still below the 1937 peak of 194 and 38 peak of 158. Of course, unfortunately for the bulls, the buying panic was now over, and the Dow would not trade at the 139 peak until by the end of World War II. So, obviously, because this affected everyone. World War II was the biggest war there's existed in humankind, and it affected everything. It affected every economy in the country, because every country is making a deal with another country, and if that other country has an ally being very defeated by the enemy, that their friends, probably the person who's friends with them, has lended money to them, and they're losing, and that's affecting them. It's like a whole chain event. And then the other guy gets scared by watching, so he doesn't want to lend anything. So it creates a whole chain event. During the first weeks of the World War II, Germany's new blitzkrieg tactic quickly overran Poland. By mid-September, Russia entered the war by invading Poland from the east. French and British forces were unable to lend Poland their promised assistance, and the gallant Poles were forced to capitulate to the overwhelming German-Russian forces by the end of September. And then during the phony war, or the 6-month lull that followed the conquest of Poland, the Dow was at 10-point range, and its initial exuberance at the outset of World War II faded. Wall Street was unmoved by Germany's successful incursion into Denmark and Norway in April 1940. So remember that the market fell down a lot, mainly because Hitler's blitzkrieg exactly on this day invaded France, Luxembourg, Belgium, and Netherlands. And the biggest concern in Wall Street was that they knew if by this time Germany invaded them and their economic power, they were becoming very fearful that the weapons that they sold them would go worthless, because they wouldn't use it because they're going to be defeated. So that's what caused this selling panic. And I think that goes to show that the U.S. really sold them a lot of resources to fight against. It led to this sentiment. And the market bottomed here, went up like always when the worst events happens. But then it started to go, bottom from here. And, the market bottomed actually when Hitler successfully captured Paris. And I think it took him, I can't recall exactly. That's pretty fast. It took Hitler Paris, most of all. Yeah, it took him 8 days to conquer Paris in June 14. Yeah, that's exactly, about 6 weeks. That's pretty quick, especially in that time. So that's what led to this fear. And many of the U.S. were now starting to get worried, especially, of course, that Hitler was now becoming such a big power in Europe that, it starts to become, when the Wall Street saw this, that starts to get a fear inside their minds to know if the U.S. will really get involved. Now this is a much more bigger threat to the U.K., and not even unsure if the UK can even stand against them. So that's where I think in that time when all these events happened a few weeks later, that's when people started to double think down that what if the US gets involved into this? Because now this problem is getting actually worse and it's getting out of control that I don't think the UK is able to control, especially that the Soviet Union is along their side. So it's a huge threat towards modern civilization. Wall Street wasn't moved by Germany's succession in invading Denmark and Norway, but that wouldn't last for long because the most severe collapse happened when Germany invaded those two lower countries. Yeah, exactly from early May, which is what I said. And in just 1 month's time, the Allied forces were thoroughly routed and forced from the European continent in a humiliating evacuation at Dunkirk. Yeah, that was a failure near the Belgian border. And by mid-June, the German army marched into Paris, and the French subsequently surrendered. During this period, the Dow plunged 25%. And as previously, giddy investors realized that the U.S. companies would have a hard time selling war products to defeated nations, the Dow's terribly decline was almost certainly exuberated by a rumor that was spread that the New York Stock Exchange was going to be closed. Even articles publicly that the stock market to be closed, question mark. Yeah, it's an incentive to sell more. Over the summer and fall of 1940, the Dow rallied back up as Britain fought off the Germans to remain in that war. And for the next year, the Dow was trading within this range as the German forces scored additional victories in the Balkans and North Africa. Exactly. And now we're looking at 1941. So there was a lot of war was happening during this period with Germany trying to invade other countries and plannings and now military getting really involved in each country. The situation got worse and worse and worse, but the Britons weren't able to fight off. But Germany was succeeding a lot in North Africa and many regions, and they started to really expand their empire. Many of the Europe, which I think a lot of you know that, and this is when it started to happen. But during this period of 1941, Germany began a massive invasion of Russia. So that was Operation Barbarossa. And when Germany just invaded Russia, I don't know if you guys know this, how much you know about history, but when Germany just invaded Russia, that's when Joseph Stalin, that's when Stalin decided, like, to hell with this guy. He knew he was going to be a threat. He was just trying to control him like a puppet, but he knew that you can't control the dog with the leash, especially with that dog is Adolf Hitler. And he decided the terrible mistake he did, which then forced him to turn to the Allies, to the UK and the United States. So that was the only time in history that the Soviet Union became friends with the UK and the US, were both very, very different, but they had to because they had a both common enemy. And that's very interesting. I somewhat wish, but things happen for a reason. Someone wish like we had that sort of alliance right now, because the world would be in better some ways, because enjoyment and agreement with each other to understand each perspective, which won't happen always. That's never going to happen. But those times were good because people started to understand the power of cooperating. And, you can even see here that compelled the Soviets to join the Allies, because they knew that Germany was so powerful, and Russia was, during this time, I don't know if you guys know, Russia was just starting their program in increasing so much industrial operations, because when Hitler invaded Poland, Stalin understood the threat of this man, and he subsequently behind the scenes started to provide this huge amount of spending in so much industrial factories, but that was specifically for economic strength to supplement the potential war that they could get involved in, especially with Germany. And he was right, that did happen, but he knew that it wasn't enough because he started too late, and it wasn't enough. He knew that his calculations, there could be more risk than the benefit of this sort of conflict happening, that forced him to join the Allies so he could have, let's say, an insurance in case that his supplies won't run as effectively and he won't lose more than he should. That's why Stalin chose to talk with Winston Churchill, why Winston Churchill, Prime Minister in that time of England, flew to Russia, and they both talked about it, and they were basically allies. So, and the same with the US. Now, during this time, remember that Roosevelt got elected during the Great Depression, and he's still the president. Roosevelt is the longest lasting president the US has ever had, and there's a good reason, because I find it hard that many people criticize him. I don't want to talk about much about politics, but Roosevelt was not a bad president at all, because he was able to bring the country out of these crises in such a great way. Of course, it was a terrible consequence, but I mean, who else would have responded towards that situation, right? It's not an easy thing to go through. So he got reelected for the third term, especially his experience with crises, that this could do well, and maybe some other additional factor. But this initiated what he made the Lend-Lease program. This allowed the U.S. to lend or lease war supplies to any nation deemed vital to the defense of the United States. By June of 1941, Germany invaded Russia prior to the program, hence inclining the Soviets to join the Allies. When Operation Barbarossa was happening, remember that Germany, you have to recall, which I've always thought about, Germany in that time was not such a big country. They just had such a effective military. They were super strong, but there was just not that much people. But the thing is, back in that time in Russia, I mean, Jesus, Russia was huge. It was the biggest country in the world. And because of that, the amount of soldiers that they could fight against the Nazis were an enormous amount, where Stalin knew that many soldiers would die, and he knew that many of his soldiers would die because of the amount of efficient tactics the Germans would do. But the offset of that short-term period to last longer by, okay, it doesn't matter, I can just resupply my men. He knew that Germany couldn't do that because there was little soldiers to begin with, because Germany isn't as big, especially when they had to they were facing other wars simultaneously in Operation Barbarossa in different countries that not all these soldiers could have been deployed. I remember in that time that Stalin had about 40 million 20-year-old soldiers, which is a lot. That's a lot to be able to work as his power heel. Germany had about 2 million. That's a huge difference. That means that by time Stalin knew that Germany wouldn't last so effectively, because if he kills a lot of them in a certain period of time, he knew that would flush out all the 2 million soldiers, and that would leave out to get all the ones that are not applicable or as effective in war combat to come in, like people in their 40s or 50s. And that's why Russia, which some people, it's one of the most controversial war, because many people have their own opinions, but that's why Russia, I would say, if it wasn't for Russia in a way, Russia's what helped Hitler Germany, to be hit so bigly, because Russia took advantage to deplete Germany's energy. And by the time in Operation Barbarossa, which Stalin was successful, which it took years to succeed, it took Leningrad, it took Stalingrad, after all these events, the Germans left out years afterwards. And then by 1945, really, the Americans came in, the Allies were able to beat them in easily, because they were already weak from the Russians. So that's why this event is so interesting, because it's the only time in history where a lot of nations that have such a different ideology about the world has helped each other towards fighting a common evil in a way. And I think it's just fascinating to watch that. So Germany, by this time, and we're going back to 1941, was succeeding, especially prior Operation Barbarossa. But when Barbarossa happened, you had the Lend-Lease program, and on December 7th, of course, 1941, that's when Pearl Harbor came Japan, as they already allied with Germany and Italy, and they launched a devastating, surprising attack on the U.S. Pacific Fleet stationed at Pearl Harbor, and the U.S. declared war on Japan the following day.
Was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. The United States was at peace with that nation. I have directed that all measures be taken for our defense, but always will our whole nation remember the character of the onslaught against us. No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory.
As of 3 days later, Germany and Italy declared war on the U.S. despite the apprehension that many Americans must have felt at this time. Wall Street had already discounted U.S. entry into World War II, and you guys can see that actually. That was when was the Pearl Harbor? That was on December 7th. So the market was going down, and right on December 7th, when Pearl Harbor happened, you can actually see exactly on the day. In fact, that was December 7th. The market actually closed. The market closed for 3 days. Because look, this is December 5th, and it reopened at December 8th. Yeah, this would be Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. Oh, okay, no. That was on a Sunday. I'm sorry. No, the Pearl Harbor attack was on Sunday. And of course, everyone sold the next day. But look, the market, of course, never goes in a straight line. It went up and down. But that's what caused the selling. So things were getting worse. Germany was invading these other countries. The U.S. got involved into the war, which panicked more into Wall Street. Yet, if you look just 4 months later or 5 months later, the market bottomed. There was no reason for it to bottom. And look what happened afterward. This enormous rise. Let's see what happened prior, though. So during this time when Pearl Harbor, by 1940, when most of continental Europe was conquered by the Germans, the secular bear market that began in the height of optimism in 1929 finally reached its bottom at the height of despair in the early spring of 1942. After crippling the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, the Japanese went on to score major victories in the Philippines and Dutch Indies to become the dominant power in the resource-rich region. In Europe, Germany controlled much of its continent and had just missed capturing the Russian capital of Moscow. Exactly, that was during Operation Barbarossa. And Britain was the last major power in the region to face off Germany. So this was a very intense time because fascism and totalitarianism involved in the majority of European nations, and democracy and liberalism appeared to be an endangered species. And this led to the US itself of not being immune to Japan's and Germany's and Italy, depriving the US constitutional rights. And a lot of Americans were forced into internment camps. You can actually see the photos here of the Japanese capturing a lot of Americans. And it was a very tough time because the Japanese were completely fascist, like during this time, extremist. And I think many people are going to be watching this from multiple cultures, but every culture now is more modernized. Back then it was this extreme, and this is beyond our time. Everyone that's lived right now, it's no one's fault because you weren't even alive back then. You didn't do anything. You couldn't even do anything, so it's no one's fault. It's just something that came after cause and effect, and that's usually what happens. You can see by investors who once thought that the good times would never end in 1929 now fear that the stocks in the economy would remain depressed indefinitely. Can you imagine that? Thinking of that, and many people think that makes sense because you have this terrible war and everything, just the Americans being captured, and especially if you're listening to the media of how things are getting worse in wars and how many people they're killing, what sort of political views are they looking for, what type of world they want to build. There's indicative that there's a complete disdain for common stocks for investors. And another indication of a lack of interest in stocks, which was very interesting, was that the relative small amount of press the stock market received. Unlike the 20s and even 30s, there were very few articles written about the stock market. The few that were written were, of course, bearish, because everyone lost money from the Great Depression. It's like they don't even want to touch stocks anymore. And the ones who are touching stocks, they're talking a lot of bad things about the market. You have Wall Street saying Wall Street woes. Nation says that Wall Street in 2 wars, investors' enthusiasm was so low that even a 91.5% dividend yields in companies did not promote more people to buy stocks. And that's crazy. A 91% dividend yield. And people didn't even want to bother stocks. They didn't trust stocks. They thought stocks were completely scam. They thought it was worthless. And there was just such a depressed market that this all occurred in March 1942. And you want to know what happened in March 1942? 2 months later, the market bottomed and it went up. See, in the worst times that the market's so depressed, that's when the market goes up. Because what else worse can come afterwards? There can't be something more worse to topple above that. And that's the thing that people don't understand. That's why you're not supposed to sell when everyone's selling. You're supposed to buy when everyone's selling, because that's when likely everything that's been sold has been sold to the maximum amount, because there's nothing bad to be there's not another bad event that's going to be worse than the last event, because a lot of the bad already happened. And that's the same case on good events. When a lot of good events have happened, I'm talking about in the short term, not in the long term. In the long term, it will go up. In the United States, I don't know about in different countries, but because the consumption in this system in the United States works very well, because people want to live a better life. They don't want to lose money. People want to buy stuff. They want to have more phones, more cars, a better life for their children. That people don't want to intentionally become depressed. So that's why there's going to be overall more spending, more product brandness, and you can see that's what happened here. The market kept going up. The market bottomed when the worst fear, and that's why I said that the market is not the economy. It's an anticipation of it, and it's a voting machine of what happens in the economy, yet when it's not even happening yet, right? And after a certain event to the extremists, it tends to bottom likely, and that's what happened. Can you imagine if you sold here in the market? You're so in denial that the market's rigged that you're still denial up to here. That's just sad. That's very unnecessary because of what we're learning now. You don't have to do that. If you were doing that, you don't have to do it anymore. There's no need to. I'm giving you permission to not lose more money. You don't need to lose more money. You don't have to do what other people are telling you to do. You can finally understand the facts of what really goes on about the market, because this isn't bullshit. I'm showing you since 1928, and there's no one in the world, not even the president, no one in the world can dispute that the market does not reflect what things happen right now, but they reflect an overall what will happen long term. But people's anticipations and thoughts about it reflects in the short term, which reflects the downward movement of selling. But that's where it goes, where the bad situation, there's no more bad to happen. And it's a display of consumption. After the bottomed, months later, after in June of 1942, which is right here, during this time, the U.S. won a decisive war against the Japanese at Midway, which left them on the offensive of the remainder of the war. In October, the British defeated the Germans on land for the first time, which was El Alamein. And then by the end of the year, the Russians were completely destroying the Germans on Stalingrad. So you had the Germans started to lose a lot of the wars in this time, and the market kept going up because during 1942, which I have here, the Japanese has been scoring a lot of successful victories from crippling the U.S. fleet around Pearl Harbor, which led to the successful conquering of the Philippines and Dutch Indies to become the dominant power within rich resources. Britain, on the other hand, had the last kingdom standing facing Germany. And months later, in June 1942, the U.S. won the Midway, the British won the Alamein, and the Soviets won Stalingrad. And all this was happening months after the bottom, which helped support that bullish trend, and it did. It kept going up, and this is when Germany started to see a lot of losses, really. You have 1943, which the war dispute was out. This was the Smith-Connolly Act over the veto of President Franklin D. Roosevelt during June. The law allowed the president to seize control of striking industries that could interfere with war production during the World War II. And this is what helped boom the markets and what helped boom enormously the US, because everyone started to support each other. Every industry, like right now, if this exists back then, every industry, Apple, Microsoft, Google, biggest companies, Tesla, McDonald's, like every industry had to help for the war, because it was taking so much resources economically in the government and central banks that they needed a lot of companies to help them. And this helped a lot of companies because they learned from these wars new products that they could develop from the wars, because it was extreme circumstance. They had to develop such high technology, which involved nuclear and energy source that was then provided back to the products many of the other years, which was then the baby boom. And that's what led to a lot of products to these baby boomers, but we'll talk about that later. The law allowed the president to seize control of these striking industries that could interfere with war production during World War II. Allied forces took back North Africa. Italy surrendered to the Allied forces. Dumbuster raids on Germany dams, Warsaw Jewish ghetto, the uprising on General D. White, and then Russia taking back Stalingrad. Following American involvement in the war, manufacturers around the U.S. became as efficient at producing war machines as they had been producing other goods, like companies like Ford and General Motors managed to change from cars to bombs and aircraft engines. And at the same time, due to the number of men overseas fighting the war was using now more women, and they were manufacturing a total of 18 million women were employed. And that's awesome, because if it wasn't for the World War II, women wouldn't have the amount of rights that they have now. And I think that was a great cause. You see, like, that's why I say that whenever there's a struggle in worldwide in the country, something great will happen, because there's a learning, there's a discovery that comes out of that, out of using another resource into the event and seeing how that resource plays out and seeing how effective it is. And it was an accidental, but this led to a lot of women finally being employed and finally have more of the rights, show themselves to the world that they're capable of doing a lot of things that could help evolve in many areas. And also due to shortages, Americans saw this was the first time that they were seeing rationing. Italian and German forces surrendered in North Africa as the war in Europe starts to turn to the Allies' way. So you see, this is when the war started to turn more towards the Allies, and Germany started to lose during this time. Of course it will lose. You can't conquer the world by enforcing it. That's not how reality works. You can't go up and try to not make allies. You have to make allies. It's super important. Now, by 1944, France was finally liberated. June 6, 1944, because this was D-Day, via D-Day, England was able to finally liberate France. And then also on June 4th, Rome was also liberated. North Africa removed Nazis and Italian oppression from rebels and Allied forces' victories on battles. And Leningrad was, in that time, the most costly, well, nowadays it still is. Finally, the War of Leningrad ended, showed the most costly sieges ever that the USSR won, and then London was bombed by V2 and V3 rockets. But despite all this, what did the market do? Look, it went up. And that was on June 6, 1944. That happened right here. Okay, June 6th. England liberated France on this day, and the markets went up. But of course, that's not a big factor, but it's a leading factor. The market went down more because people go like, oh my God, the world's going to do better, much better, but it goes back down. It's not how it works. The market doesn't take in macro events effectively. On July 44, a month after France finally got liberated, this is when the Bretton Woods was created. Now, for some of you who don't know what the Bretton Woods is a super important, vital thing the U.S. did, because this is what secured their power and this is what made them the world order. The Bretton system of monetary management was the rules of commercial and finance relation. It finally combined and grabbed all together all these nation of allies that were helping each other, and they finally negotiated into govern monetary to help each other in funds, to help each other. And what the monetary system required was that countries to guarantee convertibility of their currencies to US dollar. Why? because out of all this, the US had the strongest now economics in the world, more than England, because England got themselves in so much debt that they're not able to recover because of the war. They had so much debt from World War I, and now when they had this sudden World War II, England wasn't the world power anymore. They lost it, and they gave it to the US. And the US didn't have much competition. They had the most gold in the world. They had the most assets. They had the most resources because they didn't go much into the war. When everyone was fighting decades ago, when the Great Depression in the 20s, when World War I, all these European countries were fighting, the US was saving all the money, and they were investing heavily into the money, similar to China now. That's what China has been doing. But that's what the US did back in the 1920s and 1910s. And because of that, when World War II happened, after every enemy was flushed out and cut, the US was left victorious, and they were the ones who had the power. And everyone was forced to convert their currencies into the US dollars because it was the strongest currency in the world now. Because they were able to, within 1% of fixed parity rates, get dollar converted into gold completely. And central banks had $35 per troy ounce of fine gold. I mean, that's rich resources. Countries had to get out of themselves in debt. They didn't want poor and poverty anymore. They needed to secure, actually, to help, because they knew that the amount of cost that they would have to recover to Germany, and they would have to fix a lot of things in Germany with such political constructions and even economical, that they needed the help from the US. And in order to do that, the US made a deal with them, which is to put their funds and fund the US. Really, they gave their money to the US like a bank. A lot of companies deposited their money into the US like the bank, and because of that, the US was now the richest country, because they were able to use that money in circulation. Hence, they have more buying power. They have now the power to overspend more than any other country in the world, and a huge amount in investments, in consumption. It was the greatest thing that happened to the US, and that's what secured them. That's why the US is the way how it is now today, because of what happened in World War II. But that was in the Bretton Woods. That's why it's very, very important, the Bretton Woods. And then by 1945, finally, during August 6th, the American B-29 bomber dropped an atomic bomb on the Hiroshima. And 3 days after that, they dropped a B-29 bomb on Nagasaki. Hundreds of thousands of people died in this bomb. Of course, a lot of people, this is a very ethical question, because a lot of innocent people that, let's say, wasn't involved in the war in ways, which is what people criticize about everything in ways of killing innocents, is a matter of ethical question. But you need to understand that back in that time, many people were so enraged and were so resented in what Japan did to them, to Pearl Harbor, because it killed. Think about it. Think about, like, if your father and your brother died and the Japanese killed them for the Pearl Harbor, you would have a very big hatred with the Japanese. And the same thing is to be said if it was in another reverse world, where the North Americans did a Pearl Harbor to Japan, and a lot of Japanese felt resentment towards the North American. This isn't a matter of cultural question. This is a matter of ethical question of killing innocent people. So that's why a lot of people, this costed 118,000 lives of Americans that were families. And a lot of families were anguished and angry with these high feelings, with rage towards Japan, that it was almost inevitable that the US had to end this terrible war now and immediately. And I remember I read that in 1944, Japan was losing now almost every war. And when they were losing almost every war, when they were losing so many battles, that's when the emperor became more relentless. And he said that we're going to fight to the absolute death. And every soldier, that's the thing about Japanese people, they fought to the bitter end, like, because they're samurais. It's like that samurai spirit. Like they fight to the bitter end, and they don't care what's in front of them. And that's very dangerous. So they thought, we don't want to fight. This is horrible. This is so stupid, and you're going to die. So the US said, okay, if we're giving you this agreement, if you don't agree with it, we're going to have to forcefully use this in a destructive way. And that's what they did. They gave him a warning, and that was by once and all sending a nuclear bomb to these two cities. And of course, Japan surrendered. Of course it did. Like, they don't, and you know, with that bomb, that's when the US showed to the world who they are. That's when Russia stood back in many of these countries. And that's what totally secured. It reminds you of like the Alpha, like when you defeat a big colony in a very tough way, and you literally stop the war from an atomic bomb, because the US really stopped the war in World War II. They officially stopped the war, and many countries that were involved in allies of Germany and in Japan surrendered, because they didn't want to mess around with the US at all, especially after that demonstration. That's why I said that the US really secured their power there. They showed their superiority in economic power, and they did. They ended the terrible war, and they were finally able to secure their position in the post-war. And that's what led the US to become very powerful with the Bretton Woods, nuclear, militarily, and economically. And we have that now ever since. Now we have China. So you see, it's like both. It's interesting. This is 1946. So now World War II officially ended, especially that nuclear bomb ended for sure the World War II. Especially in this year, Hitler died. He committed suicide. I think he committed suicide. He died on April 30th. Yeah, well, there's a lot of speculation. The biggest rumor is that he consumed cyanide and he killed himself like in a matter of minutes. So cowardly, of course, very cowardly. But what do you expect from a person like that? April 10th, look right here, and he was obviously mentally ill. I've read so many. I know a lot about history and the amount of things that he did. He was taking so many drugs and all these type of things. Like it's insane that people were. It's rational towards the rage when you pound hatred towards one another. It rationally really leaves out of the door, and any sort of ridiculous outclaims becomes rational to you. That's the danger about thinking in an irrational way with hatred and resentment and all these sort of things. What happened here? And look, the market completely shot up after he died. During this period, the market kept going up, of course. And then by 1946, the market fell. And this was actually the post-World War II bear market. That was in 1946. Yeah, and this was actually called the forgotten bear market because if we go towards that date, this post-World War II bear market was caused by investors wrongly assuming the end of war spending caused an economic slowdown. So a lot of Wall Street was wrongly assuming that there was going to be an end of war spending, and that war spending would cause an economic slowdown. Instead, there was a period of massive inflation coming along with pent-up demand as those who returned from the war looked to plant their roots. So there would be no recession. So there was a lot of people that were stagnant in the market, but when the market went inflated a lot after, obviously, you have these soldiers who fought a terrible war looking at some crazy ideologies from the Nazis and how they're killing innocent Jewish people and all these sort of things. They don't want to come home and they're going to make babies, because that was the thing about back then. So this is what created that baby boom. The baby boom was from the World War II soldiers coming back, these huge amount of people coming back that were poor, especially from the Great Depression, that they had no choice to go to the war. And all these people, because everyone got married at such a young age, like younger than me, made children. And those children are the baby boomers, which are my grandparents. Yeah, it's interesting. So there would be no recession during this time. And that's what caused the drawdown from wrongly assuming. Yeah, like always, what happens when the market goes down? A lot. More likely it's going to go back up. And that's what happened. Market kept going up, back up. And yeah,